Overcoming Prejudice. The student and staff worked hard to produce an amazing and entertainment show for the audiences. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate the cast and crew of Zombie Prom for their wonderful performances. They should all be very proud of their hard work to make this year's production a success.
Thank you very much. Time allotted for member statements has almost expired. We'll just get ready for the beginning of oral questions put by members to ministers on this fine Tuesday afternoon. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Today in this building, Mr. Speaker, Carolyn Fox bravely told the story of her daughter Kaylee. Just 4 months ago, Kaylee died from a mental illness. She sought treatment, Mr. Speaker. Kaylee did everything that we would ever ask of her. 3 times she went to the emergency room for help, each time to be turned away. Kaylee was a great athlete. She was great in school. She had strong family support, Mr. Speaker, but the system let her down. The government says there is no crisis in mental health care, Mr. Speaker, but there is a crisis, and Kaylee's family knows it. I'd like to ask the Premier, will he now agree that there is a crisis in the delivery of mental health services in our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank Kaylee's family for being here today to express their heartache, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, and the province's heartache. Whenever we lose a young person, the Minister of Health has been working across the province with healthcare clinicians to provide what they are seeing as the best practices that they've advised him and the department to provide across community-based services. The Minister of Education has continued to invest in Schools Plus programs with continuing to hire more clinicians in our school system. I believe now we're at 29 to early detection of onset of mental health issues, Mr. Speaker. We know there is more work to do. We know that by continuing to work with families who, like Kaylee's, who have expressed their experience, we know that we can continue to fill and provide those supports for families across this province, but we will continue to need the help of Nova Scotians to help us guide us and the work that we're doing along with our clinicians to make sure that we're providing those services to communities across the province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Kaylee was an ambitious young girl. She had her whole life ahead of her. She wanted to do the best she could as a Nova Scotian and to help others, Mr. Speaker. She was known for reaching out to other students who she believed were similarly suffering from mental illness, from depression. Mr. Speaker, we have a bill before the House now called Kaylee's Law to start to take steps, concrete steps, to help fill the gaps in our mental health system. I know it's been introduced today, but I'd like to ask the Premier, will he look at passing Kaylee's Law in this session of the Legislature?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the gentleman for the question. The bill that was introduced today, we'll look at that piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, and we'll review it in the context of the legislative agenda and also with Kaylee and her family in mind, Mr. Speaker, and we'll be happy to review that like we do with all bills that are put before this House.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Kaylee's mom actually came to the House with a solution, a step forward to help other young women like Haley and others who are mentally ill, Mr. Speaker, need help. She says we need to take a comprehensive look at the healthcare delivery system. We need education, health, finance, and justice working together to take a look at this serious problem. We need solutions. Mr. Speaker, that is the greatest call that could possibly be made for a public inquiry into the state of mental health care delivery in the province of Nova Scotia. I would like to ask the Premier once again, will he commit today to calling a full public inquiry into the state of our mental health care system?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable for the question. Tell him that Department of Education, Department of Justice, Department of Health have been working across department lines, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we're providing services to Nova Scotians, whether it is in a school-based program, whether it is the Department of Health that is working with clinicians to provide community-based solutions for communities across this province. Tell the honourable member we know there's more work to do. We'll continue to do that work. We'll continue to reach out to our partners. And yes, we'll continue to tear down the walls inside of government so that all departments and all members of our province know that we have a responsibility to work together to ensure that we're providing the services that Nova Scotians want in a unified way and not in the siloed way that's been provided across this province in the past.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, a year and a half ago, this government told us that the Bloomfield project was moving towards a start date. In October 2014, the Minister of Community Services posted on her website that construction of Phase 1 would begin in 2015. I will table that. Well, Mr. Speaker, 2015 has come and gone, and there's no start date in sight. So I asked the Premier, why did his government fail to honour the commitment made by the Minister of Community Services to begin construction on the Bloomfield project in 2015?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank the Minister for the work that she's been doing across the province to provide affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work through the Minister with communities across this province to find community-based solutions to affordable housing in Nova Scotia. I want to thank the residents of Bloomfield who brought together a proposal to the former government, Mr. Speaker. I do want to remind the honourable member that it was her government that paid twice as much that any private sector thought that property was worth. We've also identified now, Mr. Speaker, there's potentially other options. We're reviewing those options, and the Minister will make some announcement in the coming week.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Premier did not want to get involved in the Bloomfield project, he was free to say so after he took office. However, he did not. He could have interjected at any point over the last few years while the Minister of Community Services has been promoting the project. He did not. As recently as January 29th of this year, the Minister told the media that the Bloomfield project would indeed go ahead. So I asked the Premier, why after 2.5 years is he now saying his government could pull out of the Bloomfield project?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to assure her the Bloomfield project will go ahead, Mr. Speaker. The only question is, Mr. Speaker, who's going to be the owner and who's going to occupy it, and, Mr. Speaker, who's going to build it.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, for those hoping to see more affordable housing availability, the Premier's announcement on Friday was a big disappointment. The Premier has had this file for 2.5 years, and yet he still remains unclear about what he wants to do, leaving the project clouded in uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, this is not the type of leadership that the province needs to address affordable housing. So I ask the Premier, when will he make a final decision on the fate of the Bloomfield project?
The Honourable Premier.
Within the week.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. When young Nova Scotians don't get the counselling or mental health services that they need, Mr. Speaker, it can lead to tragic results. Depression, severe anxiety, schizophrenia, they can all be treated if they are addressed early on, Mr. Speaker. But too many young Nova Scotians wait too long to get the mental health care services that they need. At the IWK, the wait list now for adolescent mental health is 176 days. That's almost 6 months, Mr. Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister, why do young Nova Scotians in need have to wait 6 months to get the mental health care services they need at the IWK hospital?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that at the IWK we have of course, a first-class, a world-class place in which our adolescents receive treatment on an ongoing basis. Some, in fact, of those that are on the list have already been assessed, and some are receiving some care in their communities. Others on the list are part of ongoing treatment. They've had multiple occasions to be in contact with the IWK. We know that right across the province, province. We are working to make sure that we have more clinicians, expand Schools Plus, and add clinical capacity from one end of Nova Scotia to the other so that our youth get early intervention.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, that is just the point. It's a great facility if you get in. Mr. Speaker, the Minister talks about adolescents, young Nova Scotians who are on the list. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've all learned, and I'm sure we all agree, that leaving young Nova Scotians who are mentally ill on a list waiting for care is a very risky thing to do, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister to tell us he's not satisfied to leave young Nova Scotians on a list waiting to get in to a terrific facility, and tell us today what is the plan to get them off the list and make sure that every single one of them gets the mental health care that they need.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It was just a few short years ago that we all know we had over 900 on the list waiting for assessment at the IWK. Under the Together We Can strategy, great strides have been made to reduce the list, and the goal, of course, is to get all Nova Scotians within 30 days to be assessed for what care, what program, who back in their community they can receive counselling from. And we know that the first place, I think, for providing care is in the school setting, and we're expanding, and we have a lead practice in the country in School Plus, as Dr. Janet Davidson identified when she came in to look at adolescent mental health.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, earlier today our caucus released a letter sent to the Premier this past January. The letter was signed by 17 of this province's most prominent law firms. Mr. Speaker, this is unprecedented. These well-respected leaders in our community are unanimous in their thinking that this government's decision to discontinue funding to the Law Reform Commission is a mistake, and I will table those letters. Given that the Premier hasn't replied to the hundreds of lawyers represented by these 17 firms, I would like to give him the opportunity to do so now. Can the Premier respond to the concerns raised by the legal community about the elimination of funding for the Law Reform Commission?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. The responses that came to our government would have responded to through the Department of Justice. Often things that are sent to the Premier's office would be sent off to the ministers to respond to. But specifically to this question, Mr. Speaker, we gave the legal community a year's notice that we would be discontinuing our funding for this commission. We are still giving them space, Mr. Speaker, an in-kind space they're able to use. Mr. Speaker, we were hoping that over the year that they would be able to find some funding to continue to do their work. It's my hope that perhaps those 17 law firms who've taken the time to write to tell how important it is perhaps will contribute financially to make sure that they have the resources they need and support government as we provide them with the space as an in-kind motion.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it would be inappropriate for the Law Reform Commission to seek private funding, and I've tried to make that point on several occasions. The Premier has also received letters from the Nova Scotia Barrister Society, the Canadian Bar Association, the Schulich School of Law, Dalhousie Legal Aid, the Alberta Law Reform Institute, and the Federation of Law Reform Agencies of Canada. The decision to eliminate funding to this democratic institution is taken straight from the playbook of the Harper Conservatives, a decision widely criticized by legal experts. The Commission's work is critical, and the real costs of terminating funding greatly outweigh any perceived financial benefits. Does the Premier agree it is in the best interests of Nova Scotia to follow in the footsteps of the discredited Harper government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question and her ability to stretch the parameters around the question. But the reality of it is, Mr. Speaker, we gave the Law Commission a year's notice. We're providing them in-kind space, Mr. Speaker. They continue to operate. It is, and I want to correct the Honourable Member, it would not be inappropriate for law firms to contribute to this commission if they believe in the work that's happening there so much. Mr. Speaker, some of the lawyers are doing pro bono work. We continue to work and ask them to work in collaboration with our government. We're more than happy to be a partner with them, and we're doing so, and we'll continue to provide and offer that space, Mr. Speaker, free of charge.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. All across the province, people young and old, but all too often more so young than old, are turning up in emergency rooms and they're looking for help. And they are many times quickly in and out of there, turned away saying, "You're okay," or "Come back at another time when we can help you. Come back on Monday." I hear people in Pictou County saying they're told at the Aberdeen. Mr. Speaker, it's not good enough. So I'd like to ask the minister today, does he accept that this is happening, and does he accept that it's a serious, dangerous issue?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for an important question. We know that now across the province, Dr. Linda Corey and her team are assembling the necessary resources to provide mental health services right across our province. And I believe that as we improve and add resources, as we train doctors in particular now to go and receive extra professional development around mental health support to patients, I think those are great strides forward. And as the member knows, and as we know right across Canada, Dr. Jane Philpott is very concerned about mental health, and there will be initiatives coming federally. We all know there is more we can do.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is more we can do, and there's more we need to do quickly. And I'd like to redirect to the Minister of Youth. The Youth Secretariat hasn't issued a report in years. Meanwhile, we have young people all across the province having the courage to reach out and ask for help, and they're being let down. So I'd like to ask the Minister responsible for youth, will the Minister make it a priority to work with the Minister of Health and put the arm on him to make these changes happen quickly? Enough of the talking. We need a bit of action here. We need to help those people who are reaching out for help, and we need to do it soon.
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and in fact I do meet with young people at least 4 times a year. I would urge anyone who needs help, Mr. Speaker, or who is experiencing a crisis to call our mental health crisis line at 1-888-429-8167. And I would urge any of the members, if you know of anyone who may harm themselves or someone else, to either call 911 or go to the local emergency department.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, according to some police officers, one of their main issues that they deal with today is mental health. If the patient has to be transported, 2 officers are involved. We know that this distance can vary depending where a bed may be available in the province. 1 officer in the ambulance and 1 following in a police vehicle. Off-duty officers have to be called in to assist. A considerable amount of taxpayers' dollars, Mr. Speaker, that could be used for resources and professional development. My question to the Minister, why isn't the Department of Health providing more services for mental health patients, thereby allowing police officers to obtain assistance quickly from trained professionals?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, I want to commend the RCMP and police forces in our communities across the province. Many now who, in fact, have received mental health training. So that the proper interventions can be made. It's a wonderful step forward. We know that at times a person will need to be moved to one of our centres where there are short-term psychiatric units that, in fact, are resourced by professionals and given the care that they will need for whatever trauma they may be in.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, police officers often tell me that residents are not obtaining mental health assistance they need. Unfortunately, it also seems that often a charge has to be laid in order to have the person appear before a judge thereby finally receiving some help. Police will often tell you they do not like using the justice system to deal with these difficulties. They prefer professional assistance at the hospital. Once a person is charged, they often acquire a criminal record and find themselves unemployable because of their record. Therefore, police officers often hesitate laying charges because they know it will only compound the situation. My question to the Minister, does the Minister believe having someone appearing for a judge is the best method for patients in crisis?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And what I can tell the member opposite and all Nova Scotians is that today in our province, there will be several thousand Nova Scotians supported by the mental health system, by clinicians from one end of the province to the other, and we're very fortunate to have some outstanding professionals that are carrying out that necessary work day in, day out.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, it appears as though the Minister and the Premier have conflicting views on the Bloomfield. In October 2014, the Minister wrote on her personal website that Phase 1 of construction on the Bloomfield will begin in 2015, and then that this, and I quote, flagship project is what housing affordability will look like for decades going forth, and I will table that. Mr. Speaker, as we move forward, can the Minister of Community Services tell us what provincial flagship project will demonstrate this government's commitment to housing affordability?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. Bloomfield will continue to move forward. It will be a flagship in this province for affordability, mixed use, mixed income in the future for people to take advantage of going forward. I'm very excited about the new opportunities that are available in cooperation with the federal government and the cost sharing that's coming down through infrastructure money. We'll be making some very important announcements in the very near future, and we'll be looking at housing more people in Nova Scotia and taking advantages of the programs that are available both provincially and federally.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier's remarks that the province is considering pulling out of Bloomfield came as a surprise to those who had been listening closely to this minister for years. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister or would the Minister support a decision that would see the province walk away from the Bloomfield project?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
One thing that I can tell the honourable member is that this government is absolutely committed to housing affordability in Nova Scotia. We have exhibited that in many different ways. We have invested $42 million from the deferred federal contribution, which is a fund that was available to both the parties across the aisle, which never was spent in years and years gone by, waiting for the rainy day. The rainy day came on October 8th, 2013, when we invested that money into affordability. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Residents near the proposed Goffs Quarry site have filed complaints with the Department of Environment and the Minister directly alleging unauthorized wetland authorization going back to April 7th. The letter said the Minister responded to the residents, and I'll table her response saying that it was tree harvesting and that was activity occurring in the wetland and no approval was required. However, historical photos, and I'll table those going back to 2007, show that even when the site was a forestry site, that wetland was protected that is now cleared. And there is a difference in the Department of Natural Resources between land clearing and harvesting. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Minister has previously been provided these photos showing the disturbance. Did she order a full investigation of the alleged wetland disturbance?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. As I said in the House last week, all quarries have a form of environmental oversight, and when all that material is brought, or all the material in the application is brought to my department, the department officials they make they either deny or approve the request. It's during an appeal process that I would see all that material, so I'll be seeing it if and when there is an appeal on the situation.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, this has nothing to do with the quarry. Mr. Speaker, this has to do with a potentially illegal wetland authorization, which has nothing to do with the quarry application, and it is the Department of Environment's responsibility to investigate. Aerial photos taken last week, and I'll table those, show that in fact there are deep ruts, there's been removal of marsh grasses, and in fact the photos that I tabled earlier show that the area that's been protected since at least 2007, according to the photographic evidence, has now been completely cleared. There are deep holes and deep ruts, which would appear to be in violation of the Act. Mr. Speaker, this is not about the quarry. This is about a wetland disturbance. They've been asking for an investigation and reported to the Minister since April 7th. Will the Minister order a site investigation?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Certainly that is something I'll be looking into moving forward. All the information I've got on the wetlands and with the quarry or anything that's coming into that department, I will be seeing that during the appeal process. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Last year on June 3rd, Jackson Lawrence Fowler of Kingston unfortunately took his own life after many years of battling depression at just 20 years of age. I will table his obituary. Jackson's mother, Laura Fowler, is determined his death will help create change in our mental health system and has given me permission to bring his story to the attention of the legislature. In the obituary it says he tried all avenues for support and various outreach programs, but with the lack of proper resources, the system was fleeting at best, and sadly he fell through the cracks. My question for the Minister is, I know the Minister of Health and Wellness must have been aware of Jackson's passing last year. Can he tell me what has been done in the Valley to address the lack of resources reported in Jackson's obituary of June last year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Very familiar with this particular case, as they lived in the community where I live, and I've met with his mother to start to develop in our community and other communities, especially through the community health boards, a number of mental health support groups. We know that this is an area that can be extremely helpful. And I know we've made some progress in that regard.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister for that answer. In a June 17, 2015 article in the Kings County Register entitled "Depression is not something to shove under the carpet," which I'll table, and I will quote, it says, Laura says the system failed her son. She talked about how she tried unsuccessfully to find help, first in school and also through the mental health and addiction services. My question for the Minister is this. Can the Minister explain why it's so hard to find mental health service help in rural Nova Scotia and how he plans to fix this? And what avenues are there for parents in the same situation such as Laura?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know in our community, this case and a few other tragic mental health circumstances have propelled, I know, our community health board to do a great deal more with the youth in our area. They also have put together a mental health binder of great information and supports to people in the workplace, in community organizations. And in fact, last evening at a community meeting, I was pleased to hear that, in fact, 60-something of these resources had been moved around the community to support families who may have a loved one with a mental health condition or an acute trauma.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, a question for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, we know that around 200 schools in the province have Schools Plus. I know the Minister was down to Inverness to bring the program there, which is a great development. But, Mr. Speaker, what does a teacher do when there is a student disrupting the classroom, impacting the learning of others? Something is interfering with this child's learning, and it may very well be a matter of serious mental health, maybe a serious mental health issue. If it is, Mr. Speaker, what steps can a teacher take?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. And I think we would recognize that the challenges that students bring to the classroom are becoming more complex. Anxiety levels are very high, and it's our role to make sure that our teachers have the ability to identify the professional development to help them respond to and the resources available to them, because in some cases that student does need to be removed from the classroom for their own safety and for the safety of the others in the classroom. So we look at the Schools Plus as one of the ways where we can provide that support, look at restorative justice kinds of programs in our classrooms, but I think it's absolutely critical that the teacher is able to identify and is able to refer that student to some professional who can provide them the help they need.
The honourable member for Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister. We know that health literacy, according to the World Health Organization, is the #1 determinant of health. Being aware of a child's health, in this case, is critical. Each year there is a provincial professional development day. I'd like to ask the Minister if this is an opportunity for the department to have workshops on training for mental health issues so that teachers may be empowered to deal with these situations as they arise in the classroom.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the professional development days that are offered vary. There are the NSTU-sponsored Provincial Conference Day in October, and teachers obviously have an opportunity to have input into what those programs would be. Teachers can also stay back in their own school and put together a program that is specific to their needs. We work very closely with Dr. Stan Kuchar using the Go-To training program for teachers to help them identify and provide professional development for themselves. So there are a variety of opportunities, but the Provincial Conference Day, sponsored by the NSTU, is certainly one way for that to happen.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. The Cape Breton Regional Police Services have an officer who works in the mental health department of the Cape Breton Regional Hospital. He is well trained and is a valuable member of the healthcare team. The cutting of some of the funding to the Boots in the Street program means that position may be axed as well. Will the Minister fight to keep the funding for this valuable position within the mental health care system?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can say to the member opposite is that Boots on the Street is not being cut. It's certainly, it's in fact currently under a review.
The honourable member for Northside Westmount.
Mr. Speaker, we heard the budget estimates that the Boots in the Street budget was going to be cut because the policing system was doing so well that it wasn't necessary to keep all that funding available anymore. And Mr. Speaker, we know that because of that funding is why the crime rates are down in our province. Can the Minister assure the patients and the staff, the police system, that this police position will remain if that is one of the areas that is cut by cutting the Boots in the Street program?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps the Minister of Justice can bring more up-to-date information to respond.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think it's interesting in this case to note that the police that are funded through our municipal partners and with this additional officers program are in many different capacities. That's really what the question points out, somebody that's in the hospital. We know that a number of them as well are in schools, and I've heard from the members of my caucus and others that are very concerned and also interested that those positions remain. As we heard in estimates, the budget is down slightly, but it doesn't mean that the number of officers will be reduced, and that's the important thing, I think, is the number of officers that we have on the ground.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. The Association of Early Childhood Educators in Ontario recently reported on the effectiveness of work done to address low wages for early educators in that province. They concluded that staff wages could not be tied to parents' ability to pay or precarious funding streams like grants or subsidies. Here in Nova Scotia, the province's largest child care union and the Non-Profit Directors Association have both raised concerns about whether this government's additional investment will actually get us where we need to go, since they're tied to grants and subsidies. So could the Minister please explain how the investment of an additional $63 per child will be adequate to increase both child care affordability and wages?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm really pleased to be able to speak to our investment for early childhood education, in particular recognizing that the wages for our early childhood educators are lowest in the country, recognizing that many parents are not able to close the gap between the subsidy and the fees that are charged, and because of those two outstanding and deplorable conditions, our government invested $6.6 million to close both of those gaps.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Well, thank you for that answer, but it's interesting because I just met with the Nova Scotia Teachers Union on Friday, and they're still scratching their heads over the minister's plans with the $6.6 million. In fact, the minister has said in this House she intends to bring wages up to the national average. According to data from the department, there were more than 2,000 early childhood educators in Nova Scotia in 2013. So even if the entire $6.6 million investment went to increasing wages, which is not what has been said, each worker will only see an increase of 17 cents per hour. So would the minister care to explain how she plans to follow through on her promise to child care workers in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would say that this government is certainly committed to supporting the quality work that our early childhood educators do in this province, to recognize their importance, the important role that they play, so that families and young children can get the supports they need prior to coming to school. I would like to make one correction, though. It would be not be the Nova Scotia Teachers Union that the members should be meeting with. It would be the early childhood educators.
The honourable member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. This government has broken their promise to Nova Scotians time and time again. There is a family doctor shortage, and the minister claims that 10 new doctors are coming to Cape Breton. So my question for him would be very simple. Will the minister today confirm that these doctors plan to come to Cape Breton and set up a full practice and actually take on patients, and will he also today confirm that they are not just a short-term placement?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to say that of the 10 doctors that will be going to Cape Breton, 5 in fact have signed on for the tuition agreement, and that means a 5-year commitment for sure, and most likely a future in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River, Myra, Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much for that, Mr. Minister, but you forgot the first part of the question, is if they're going to take on a full practice. A family doctor is very important. This isn't just about common health worries and ailments. It's about mental health, too. According to the Canadian Mental Health Association, step 1 is to find a doctor, and I quote, "Step 1, find a doctor. The first point of entry into the mental health system in Nova Scotia is through an individual's family physician. Their doctor will then decide whether to treat them independently or provide you with a referral to visit a psychiatrist, counselor, and/or mental health clinic." It also goes on to say it is important that you have a doctor that creates a safe and comfortable environment to discuss your mental health issues with. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. So my question to the minister is, will the minister finally admit that the family doctor crisis is spilling over into other aspects of health care and leaving people vulnerable and at risk?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'm pleased to say to the member opposite all Nova Scotians is that just recently I signed the certification of 50 of our doctors who took part in the mental health professional development, and many others will now engage in this training, and with the development of more collaborative practices, one in fact that I've heard great results about in Berwick. This is what we need, is comprehensive collaborative care where in fact they have a mental health provider as part of the primary health team.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health and Wellness. I have had the unenviable task of being with families who had a loved one take their own life. and it's always a task that I found difficult walking into. A parent will always ask why. A parent will say, what did I miss? A parent never, ever gets over the pain of this kind of loss. There is a lot of fallout to this kind of situation. Will the minister encourage each health board to offer a support group for parents, for families who are a part of this this situation?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for his work as a minister to assist families with probably the most difficult grieving they will ever do. And I know that, again, the Nova Scotia Health Authority is looking at a comprehensive picture for mental health delivery services, and what the member references is one that also needs to be part of whether it is the psychological support, minister support in some communities and in some hospital settings, but it's certainly a service that I will review with the Health Authority to make sure that such service is available.
The Honourable Member for Colchester-Musquedabbit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a lot of families can't work through this kind of grief in a healthy way. And money, that may not even be required to have that kind of support. So my question is, will the minister meet with the mental health departments to determine what would be most helpful?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I know today we're asking some of the most important questions that have been here during this session around mental health. We know that there's always more in our communities. I'm an absolute believer that it's not necessarily hundreds of more professionals, but it is many people developing the abilities and the skills to provide within their families, their workplace, their organizations, and I certainly we'll have an opportunity to sit down with the member opposite and discuss the issue that he's brought forward today, and if there's a way that we can expand that service, that comfort to families, we'll certainly move in that direction.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hospitals across the province have needs that continue to go unaddressed by this government. Nova Scotians were shocked to learn that last year the government underspent the hospital infrastructure budget by 63%. When the minister was asked on Friday if he was satisfied with how hospital infrastructure projects have gone thus far, he said absolutely. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister, after underspending the hospital infrastructure budget by 63% last year, can he explain how he's absolutely satisfied with the progress of hospital infrastructure projects here in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, I have reviewed the past number of years, even before we came into government, and we do have a history in our province of delays with projects. Some of the projects that we picked up needed design work. We have a couple of projects with legal ramifications that must be sorted out before they move forward. We've certainly had some redesign of projects as well, and while it may seem like it is a considerable amount of millions of dollars, this money is booked. These projects will move forward.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister on several occasions continued to point to the longer term of these infrastructure projects, but there are patients in our hospitals that are concerned with their health and safety today. There are workers in our hospitals concerned for their health and safety today, Mr. Speaker. It must be difficult for these patients and healthcare providers to accept the fact that money budgeted to improve hospital conditions were dramatically underspent over the last couple of years. So I ask the Minister, how does underspending the infrastructure budget by 63% address the immediate needs of hospitals across the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I know that in our 36 hospitals, there are both small and large projects that are on the books. What I do know, if there is a question of safety, that work is on time and in place so that both staff and patients are looked after. I refer, for example, to the question of getting new steps at Northside, and I believe we got that project completed. And there are many other examples that I can refer to, both small and large projects that enhance our hospital work.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Dr. Phil Thibault is a psychiatrist, a professor. He's the Dr. Paul Jensen Chair in Psychotic Disorders at the Department of Psychiatry at Dalhousie University and a director of the Nova Scotia Early Psychosis Program. Dr. Phil Thibault has authored a number of papers on the link between marijuana usage and psychosis in young adults, and I will table several of those papers now. In his papers, he states that for a small but significant number of young adults, marijuana usage can contribute to the onset of schizophrenia and psychosis. The World Health Organization also recognized the impact of cannabis use on young adults and is linked to mental illness, and I tabled a paper on that too. My question for the Minister of Health is, can the Minister tell me what is being done by his department to address the root causes of mental illness such as this in young adults in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what I can say to the member opposite is that I'm aware of that research. In fact, very recently, I wrote an article for the local paper dealing with the use of marijuana, especially now, since cannabis is a very different product that was there in the 60s and 70s. And we know that the research, in fact, is making a very strong connection with regular use of cannabis and psychosis. I know that in our schools and also our liaison officers are doing what they can to both educate and to restrict the use. We know that we're looking to the federal government for what will become the law around marijuana in the very near future.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my second question for the Minister is, given the federal government is committed to legalization of marijuana, can the Minister assure Nova Scotians that the groundbreaking and significant research into serious health effects on the still developing adolescent brain being done here in Nova Scotia will be brought to the attention of his federal counterparts?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've actually gave a little assignment to someone who likes to do research. They looked at countries where cannabis and other drugs have actually been legalized, and it has actually been a step forward to deal with underage youth who are using cannabis, who are also other drugs as well. There's been a real connection with being able to prosecute and to be able to restrict and reduce the amount in youth populations.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And throughout question period, we've been asking questions specific to mental health services. And if you've noticed, there's been a lot of different answers because there's so many different avenues that people can access a system. There's no one right way, or really there's a whole bunch of wrong ways, but there's no one right way to actually access the system. So my first question to the Minister is, we talk about Dr. Linda Quarry, we talk about even the Federal Minister, who is responsible for mental health services in Nova Scotia.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'm first pleased to say that I actually encouraged the member opposite to ask questions about mental health, if he remembers back to about a year ago, because it is an issue facing all Nova Scotians, all of our families and our communities, and the more that we do collectively, the better results that we will have for our children and the future of our province. And I can say without question that as Minister of Health, I also have to take responsibility when there are deficits in the system.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. That is the right answer, and I thank the Minister for that, because the buck does stop at the Department of Health with the Minister to make sure that we're doing everything that we can as a government, as a legislature, as MLAs across this province to make sure that our constituents are receiving the help that they require. But what I do want to ask the Minister, and maybe something that he can table in this House later on, could the Minister provide us with a listing of the services in the province in our specific areas, maybe cut it up by constituency or by community, of where we can send our constituents to when they call us for help?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'll certainly be pleased to provide members with that. We all know as MLAs, we get a phenomenal range of questions each and every week, and the more directly we can respond to our constituents about a place, whether it's mental health or whatever other social service is required, then I believe that enhances the work of all MLAs in this House, and I'm pleased to provide that.
Order, please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers have expired. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, on introduction.
Permission granted.
Monsieur le Président, j'ai le plaisir de présenter à l'Assemblée située dans la galerie de l'Est de l'Assemblée Madame Edwina Leblanc. Madame Edwina Leblanc est l'épouse du défunt député de Richmond, Monsieur Gaston Leblanc. Gaston a été élu la première fois de l'élection générale de 1974 et réélu de l'élection de 1978. Malheureusement, M. Gaston Leblanc est décédé pendant son temps comme député le 15 février 1980. Pendant que je n'ai pas eu l'honneur de connaître Gaston Leblanc moi-même, je suis assuré par tout le monde qu'il était un député très bien respecté. Madame Leblanc a accepté l'ordre de la Pléiade au nom de son défunt époux, M. Leblanc, et elle est très bien connue dans notre communauté et bien respectée, une grande bénévole avec la Légion canadienne 150 à Richat, et je comprends que c'est sa première visite à notre Assemblée. J'espère qu'elle a bien aimé sa première visite. Mr. Speaker,